The heavy iron gate behind me groaned shut with a finality that should have felt like a relief, but instead, it sounded like a tombstone dropping into place. I stood there for a moment, the heels of my worn boots sinking slightly into the soft, rain-slicked gravel of the shoulder. The air out here was different. It didn't taste like floor wax and sour breath. It tasted like damp earth and wood smoke, a bitter perfume that signaled the arrival of a world that had moved on without me. I shifted the weight of the canvas bag, the strap digging into a shoulder that had grown lean and hard over 3,650 days of regulated movement. Inside that bag was my entire life: a release form, a bus ticket, $42 in cash, and a photograph so faded that the faces looked like smears of ash. I started walking toward the bus stop, a lonely glass shelter a half-mile down the road. Every step felt intentional, a rhythmic reclamation of my own body. For a decade, my stride had been measured by the length of a corridor, my vision bounded by chain link and razor wire. Now the horizon stretched out, vast and terrifyingly gray. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me but a concrete box and the ghosts of the woman I used to be. The woman who believed in the law, the woman who thought love was a sanctuary, the woman who had been foolish enough to trust Julian and Alina with her soul. When the bus finally pulled up, its brakes squealing a shrill greeting, I climbed the steps and handed the driver my ticket. He didn't look at me, and for that, I was grateful. To him, I was just another passenger in a drab coat. I found a seat in the back, leaning my forehead against the cold, vibrating window. As the bus lurched forward, the prison disappeared into the mist, and I watched my reflection in the glass. The lines around my eyes were deeper than I remembered, a road map of every sleepless night spent staring at a bunk above me. My hair, once a vibrant chestnut that Julian used to wind around his fingers, was now shot through with streaks of silver, pulled back in a severe, practical knot. I looked like a stranger, which was perfect. A stranger is hard to track. A stranger is hard to fear until it's too late. The city greeted me with a roar of light and noise that made my skin prickle. It was too fast, too loud, too much. People were glued to small glass rectangles in their hands, walking with their heads down, oblivious to the predator in their midst. I stepped off the bus at the downtown terminal, the smell of diesel and hot grease filling my nose. I had a destination in mind, a small boarding house on the edge of the old district where questions weren't asked if the cash was green. As I walked, I passed a newsstand. My heart skipped a beat, then hammered with a cold, rhythmic precision. There, on the cover of a local business magazine, was Julian. He looked radiant. His teeth were too white, his suit too expensive, his hand resting possessively on Alina's shoulder. The headline read, "The Golden Couple: How the Sterling Foundation is Rebuilding Our City." I felt a phantom pain in my chest, the ghost of the knife they'd twisted into my back 10 years ago. They hadn't just taken my freedom, they had built their empire on the ruins of my reputation. They had used my silence to bury their sins, and then they had celebrated my incarceration as the final piece of their puzzle. I reached the boarding house and paid for a week in advance. The room was small, smelling of lemon oil and old dust, but it had a window that looked out over the skyline. I sat on the edge of the bed, opening my canvas bag. I pulled out the faded photograph and a small, handwritten list I'd maintained in the dark. My fingers traced the names: Julian, Alina, Detective Miller. The judge who took their bribes. They thought they had erased me. They thought that 10 years would break my spirit until I was nothing but a shadow, grateful for the scraps of a life they'd left behind. They were wrong. Prison doesn't just break you, it tempers you. It burns away the soft parts, the mercy, the hesitation. I stood up and walked to the cracked mirror above the sink, splashing cold water on my face. I looked at the woman staring back, the ghost who had finally come home. They were sleeping in silk sheets, dreaming of their next success, entirely unaware that the gates had opened. Their nightmare didn't start when I was arrested. It started the moment I breathed the November air and remembered exactly how to take back everything they stole. I am not seeking justice. Justice is for the innocent. I am seeking a reckoning, and I have all the time in the world. The first night of freedom was not the peaceful slumber I had imagined during those 3,650 days of incarceration. The mattress in the boarding house was too soft, a treacherous, sagging thing that made my spine ache for the unforgiving thinness of a prison cot. In the silence of that room, the city's heartbeat felt erratic. Every hiss of the radiator, every distant siren, and the rhythmic creak of floorboards in the hallway was a jolt to a nervous system wired for the metallic clanging of steel on steel. I woke up at 5:00 a.m., my body still tuned to the morning count, my eyes snapping open to a ceiling that didn't have a bunk bolted above it. I lay there for an hour, watching the gray dawn bleed through the thin, yellowed curtains, feeling the weight of the city pressing against the walls. I had $42, a bus ticket stub, and a lifetime of resentment. It was enough to start a fire. I dressed in the same drab coat and sensible shoes I'd been given upon my release, my movements slow and economical. I needed to see what 10 years had done to the world I once helped build. I walked toward the Sterling Foundation's headquarters, a glass and steel monolith that hadn't existed when I was taken away in handcuffs. It stood in the center of the financial district like a middle finger to the heavens, a monument to the money Julian and Alina had siphoned from our joint accounts while I was being processed into a number. I found a weathered park bench across the street, unfolding a discarded newspaper to shield my face. I wasn't looking for news, I was looking for the routines of my prey. At exactly 8:45 a.m., a black town car pulled to the curb, its tires whispering against the asphalt. My breath hitched, a sharp, cold needle in my lungs. Julian stepped out first. He looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The arrogance was no longer a veneer, it was baked into his marrow, evident in the way he adjusted his cufflinks with a flick of his wrist. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who had never faced a consequence. He held the door open for Alina, his hand steady. She emerged draped in camel-colored wool, her blonde hair cut into a sharp, expensive bob that caught the morning light. She laughed at something he said, a sound I couldn't hear but could see in the tilt of her head, the same practiced, empathetic tilt she'd used when she told the jury she'd seen me signing those fraudulent ledgers. Watching them, I felt my pulse settle into a low, heavy thrum. They looked happy. They looked safe. They looked like they had forgotten I ever existed. The rage didn't boil, it froze. It became a solid, crystalline thing in my gut. I watched them disappear into the building, greeted by a doorman who bowed with practiced subservience. They were the royalty of this concrete kingdom, and I was the ghost haunting the perimeter. I realized then that my first task wasn't to strike, but to learn. The city had changed, technology had shifted, and the levers of power were no longer pulled by the same strings I once understood. I needed tools. I needed a way back into a world that had moved on without me, a world that currently viewed me as a footnote in a decade-old scandal. I walked away from the glass tower, heading toward the docks where the air grew saltier and the buildings more dilapidated. This was the city's underbelly, the place where the Sterling Foundation's rebuilding efforts hadn't reached. I was looking for a man named Salas. He had been our firm's fixer, the man who handled the unpleasantries that required a lack of conscience. If he was still alive, and if he hadn't been bought by Julian, he was my only way in. I found the bar he used to frequent, a windowless hole called the Anchor. The smell of stale beer and old regrets was the first thing that felt like home since I'd stepped through the prison gates. Silas was there, tucked into a corner booth, his face a map of broken capillaries and hard miles. He didn't recognize me at first. The woman he knew wore Chanel and carried a briefcase full of legal briefs. The woman standing before him wore a thrift store coat and carried a decade of darkness in her eyes. I sat down across from him without an invitation. He looked up, his eyes bleary but sharp with a latent instinct for danger. "We're close to strangers," he grunted, his voice like gravel. I leaned forward, letting the dim, amber light of the bar hit my face. I didn't smile, I just watched him. "I'm not a stranger, Silas," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm a debt that's finally come due. And I believe you still owe me for that mess in 08. The way his glass stopped halfway to his mouth told me everything I needed to know. His hand trembled just a fraction, but it was enough. He remembered. And for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't the only one who was afraid. Silas didn't speak for a long minute, the ice in his glass rattling like a death knell against the rim. His gaze darted to the door, then back to me, his pupils blown wide with a primitive sort of terror. He saw the ghost of the woman who once signed his checks, but he also saw the predator I had become in the shadows of the state penitentiary. I didn't need his help to kill them, I needed him to stay silent while I resurrected the past. I leaned in closer, the scent of his cheap whiskey and stale sweat filling my lungs. "I'm not here for an apology, Silas. I'm here for the key to the back door you left open." When he finally whispered the location of the old encrypted server backup he'd hidden from Julian, his voice was a broken rasp. I left him there, trembling in his booth, and stepped back out into the biting wind of a city that had forgotten my name. The bus ride to the outskirts took an hour, a jarring journey through neighborhoods that had been sanitized into glass and chrome. But as I reached the edge of the old creek, the world began to fray. This was the city's forgotten lung, a stretch of marshland and tangled brush that the developers hadn't yet managed to pave over. The air here was saltier, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of the nearby shipyards. It felt honest in a way the Sterling Foundation's headquarters never could. I found the willow tree by instinct, its silhouette a gnarled fracture against the graying sky. A lightning strike years ago had nearly split it in two, leaving the trunk blackened and twisted, its weeping branches trailing into the stagnant water of the creek like frayed nerves. I knelt at its base, the dampness of the soil immediately soaking through the knees of my sensible slacks. I didn't care about the cold or the mud. I pulled the rusted trowel from my coat pocket, my movements rhythmic and frantic. The earth was stubborn, partially frozen by the early winter chill. I dug with a feral intensity, my shoulders screaming with the effort. My fingernails split against the stones buried in the silt, the jagged edges catching and tearing. I felt the warm, sharp sting of blood welling up under the quick, mixing with the dark grit of the soil, but I didn't stop. The pain was a grounding wire, connecting me to the reality of what I was doing. I wasn't just digging for a drive, I was unearthing the only part of myself that hadn't been destroyed by Julian's lies. Then the trowel struck something that didn't yield, a sharp, plastic thud. My breath hitched, a cold needle in my chest. I set the tool aside and used my bare hands, clawing at the frozen dirt until I felt the smooth, cold surface of the waterproof casing. I wrenched it from the earth's grip, the roots of the willow clinging to it like skeletal fingers. I sat back on my heels, gasping, my chest heaving as I stared at the mud-caked box in my lap. Inside lay the raw, unedited logs of the Sterling Foundation's first crimes, the digital ghosts of the lives they had ruined to build their empire. Julian had thought he'd incinerated every trace of these files the night he'd set fire to our home office, the same night he'd stood on the lawn with his arm around a weeping Alina and told the police I'd been the one to light the match. He hadn't realized I'd anticipated his betrayal. He hadn't realized that while he was busy playing the grieving husband, I was burying his soul in the mud by the creek. I wiped the casing clean with the hem of my coat, my fingers trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of my own power. This drive contained the leverage they thought was ash. It was the blueprint of their downfall, written in Julian's own arrogant hand. I stood up, my legs stiff and my knuckles raw and bleeding, and looked back toward the city's skyline. The Sterling building was visible in the distance, a monolith of glass and light that looked impenetrable from the outside. But I knew the truth now. I had the fire and I knew exactly where the foundations were cracked. My walk back to the bus stop was different than the walk here. My steps were lighter, even as my heart grew heavier with the singular purpose of what came next. The ghost was done haunting the perimeter. It was time to walk through the front door. The bus ride back was a blur of neon and rain-slicked asphalt, a jarring transition from the primeval silence of the creek to the frantic pulse of a city that had outgrown me. I sat in the very back, the mud-caked box tucked into a plastic grocery bag I'd scavenged from a nearby bin. My fingers were stiff, the blood beneath my nails drying into dark, jagged crescents that felt like claws. Every person who glanced my way, a tired nurse ending a double shift, a teenager with glowing earbuds, a man clutching a briefcase like a shield, saw only a drifter, another woman chewed up and spat out by the city's indifferent machinery. They didn't see the weapon I was cradling against my ribs. They didn't see the fuse I was about to light. I disembarked 3 blocks from the Sterling monolith where the air changed. Here, the wind didn't just blow. It circulated, filtered and expensive, smelling faintly of ozone and vanity. I found a 24-hour laundromat tucked into a side street, its windows steamed over with the communal ghosts of 1,000 loads of laundry. In the back, under the flickering hum of a fluorescent tube, I used the utility sink to scrub the creek from my skin. The water ran brown, then a pale, watery pink as the grit of the marsh washed away. I watched my reflection in the spotted, cracked mirror above the sink. The woman staring back had hollowed cheeks and eyes that had seen too much concrete, but the fire was there, burning low and steady in the irises. I used a pair of nail clippers from my pocket to trim the torn edges of my fingernails, cleaning out the last of the silt until my hands looked like they belonged to someone who still had a stake in the world. I was shedding the skin of a prisoner, layer by agonizing layer. I had one more stop to make before I faced the glass tower. A small, hole-in-the-wall electronics shop on 4th Street was still open, run by a man whose eyes were as weary as mine and who didn't ask questions as long as the cash was green. I needed a laptop, something refurbished, something untraceable, something that wouldn't ping a home network or alert a corporate firewall. I bought a heavy silver brick of a machine and a handful of adapters. As I sat in a nearby diner, the smell of burnt coffee and industrial grease thick in the air, I finally plugged the drive in. The screen flickered to life, the blue light casting long, skeletal shadows across the laminate table. I watched the directory populate, the scrolling text a litany of Julian's sins. Thousands of files. His signature was everywhere. On the fraudulent environmental reports, the offshore transfer authorizations, the internal memos detailing how they'd squeezed the life out of small-town contractors to pad their margins. It was all there, preserved in the digital amber Silas had hidden. The Sterling legacy wasn't built on vision. It was built on a foundation of corpses and broken promises. My breath hitched when I found the folder labeled Project Phoenix. That had been our private name for the foundation's inception, a joke between a husband and wife who thought they were building a future. Seeing it now felt like a physical blow to the stomach, a reminder that the man I had loved was the same man who had orchestrated my disappearance. I didn't sleep. I spent the night in that diner, nursing a single cup of lukewarm coffee, memorizing the architecture of his greed. I followed the money trails until they bled into the dark, and I mapped out the vulnerabilities of his board of directors. By dawn, I knew exactly which thread to pull to make the whole tapestry unravel. At 8:00 a.m., the city began to wake up in earnest. The streets filled with the well-dressed soldiers of the corporate world, marching toward their glass fortresses with the rhythmic clicking of heels and the hushed tones of morning deals. I stood among them wearing a charcoal wool coat I'd bought at a consignment shop on the way. It was slightly oversized, but the cut was sharp enough to pass for professional. I'd pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot, a style that felt like a helmet. I looked like a consultant or perhaps a senior legal clerk. Someone invisible, someone who belonged. The lobby of the Sterling Foundation was a cathedral of arrogance. Polished white marble stretched toward a vaulted ceiling, and a massive kinetic sculpture hung in the center, its silver blades turning slowly like the gears of a predatory machine. I approached the security desk, my boots silent on the stone. The guard, a young man with a buzz cut and a neck that looked too thick for his starched collar, barely looked up from his monitor. "Identification?" he asked, his voice a bored, practiced drone. "I'm here to see Julian Sterling," I said. My voice was steady, a low vibration that seemed to cut through the ambient hum of the lobby. It was the first time I'd spoken his name aloud in a place he controlled. "Tell him his past has arrived for its appointment." The guard paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He finally looked at me, his eyes scanning my face, looking for a name or a reason to dismiss me. He saw the coat, the hair, the calm intensity, and he hesitated. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" "Mr. Sterling is in a high-level briefing. He doesn't know he made it," I replied, leaning slightly over the desk. I could smell his cheap cologne, a sharp contrast to the sandalwood and expensive Scotch Julian used to wear. "But tell him it's about the creek. Tell him the willow tree has finally fallen." The guard frowned, confused but sensing a weight in my words that he wasn't paid enough to challenge. He picked up the sleek silver phone. I waited, my heart a slow, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I looked up at the mezzanine, where the executive elevators hummed with the movement of powerful people. Somewhere up there, behind the soundproof glass and the Italian wool, the man who had stolen 10 years of my life was sipping his morning coffee, thinking the world was exactly as he'd ordered it. He had no idea that the water was rising. He had no idea that the mud I'd climbed out of was now staining his pristine floors. I wasn't just a ghost haunting the edges of his life anymore. I was the reckoning, and I was finally through the door. The guard's voice dropped an octave, his posture stiffening as someone on the other end of the line responded to the message about the willow tree. I saw the blood drain from his ruddy cheeks, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. He didn't look at me anymore. He looked through me, as if I were a ghost that had suddenly manifested in his curated reality. He. Mr. Sterling is occupied, the guard stammered, his hand trembling slightly against the silver receiver. But he's requested you wait. Security is on their way to escort you to a private holding room. I didn't wait for the rest. I didn't need to see Julian yet. The goal wasn't a shouting match in a glass office. It was the systematic dismantling of his peace of mind. I turned on my heel, the heavy wool of my coat swishing against my calves, and walked out into the crisp morning air before the silver elevators could even chime. I wanted him to wonder where I was. I wanted the silence after my departure to be louder than the words I'd left behind. Let him check the security feeds. Let him watch me walk away and realize that for the first time in a decade, he didn't know where I was going or what I was capable of. I knew where Alina would be. Some habits are etched in gold and cannot be broken, even when your world is built on a foundation of lies. The market was called the Verdant Leaf, a place where the wealthy paid $20 for a pint of hand-picked berries, and the air was filtered to smell like a rain-drenched orchard. It was a sanctuary of curated perfection, a world away from the metallic tang of the prison cafeteria and the smell of industrial bleach that had lived in my pores for 3,650 days. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the sudden hush of the interior wrapping around me like a shroud. The floor was a seamless expanse of white tile, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the rows of organic produce that looked more like art installations than food. I found her in the wine aisle. Alina hadn't aged the way I had. Prison had carved lines into my face like a map of a war zone, but her skin was as smooth and luminous as a pearl. She was dressed in a cream-colored cashmere wrap that probably cost more than the car I'd been arrested in, her hair a honeyed wave that caught the soft, recessed lighting of the store. She moved with a practiced, effortless grace, her fingers trailing over the labels of expensive vintages as if she were choosing which soul to crush next. She looked every bit the philanthropist, the loyal wife, the woman who had stood by Julian's side and wept crocodile tears at my trial while they buried me alive. I stepped into the aisle, my boots clicking rhythmically on the pristine tile. I didn't hide. I didn't sneak. I walked until I was exactly 6 feet away, standing perfectly still in her line of sight. She reached for a bottle of deep, dark Malbec, her rings catching the light, diamonds bought with the blood of the small-town contractors Julian had squeezed dry to pad his margins. As she pulled the bottle from the shelf, her gaze drifted toward me, a casual, dismissive glance meant for a stranger who had dared to enter her personal orbit. Then the recognition hit. It wasn't a gradual realization, it was a violent collision. Her eyes widened, the pupils blooming until they nearly swallowed the blue of her irises. The color evaporated from her face, leaving her a pale, ghostly imitation of the woman she'd been a second before. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a sharp, jagged intake of breath that sounded like a sob caught in her throat. The bottle slipped. It felt like slow motion. The dark glass tumbled from her manicured fingers, turning end over end before it struck the tile between us. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet, sterile market. The bottle shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor, and the wine, thick, dark and smelling of fermented berries, exploded outward. It soaked the hem of her cream trousers and spread across the white floor like a premonition, a widening pool of crimson that looked far too much like a crime scene. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The silence was my weapon, and I wielded it with surgical precision. I simply tilted my head, watching her chest heave as she struggled to find her breath. I offered her a thin, cold smile, the kind of smile you give a ghost when you realize you're the one who's actually haunting them. The terror that drained the color from her face was the first payment on her debt, and it was more nourishing than anything I'd eaten in 10 years. It was a glimpse of the nightmare I was about to invite into their pristine, guarded lives. She reached out for the shelf to steady herself, her hand shaking so violently that she knocked a neighboring bottle askew. "You," she whispered, the word a broken, fragile thing. "Me," I replied, my voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to make the glass shards on the floor hum. "I'm back, Alina, and I've brought the past with me." I looked down at the wine staining her expensive shoes, the red liquid seeping into the fabric of her life, then back up at her trembling form. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear that made her look small and withered. In that moment, the sterile beauty of the market felt like a cage. She was trapped in the aisle with the woman she had helped destroy, and there was no security guard, no high-priced lawyer, and no lie big enough to save her from the reality of my presence. I turned away then, leaving her standing in the wreckage of the glass and the wine, knowing that for the rest of her life she would never feel safe in the light again. The water was rising, and she was the first one to realize she couldn't swim. I left the market without looking back, the bell above the door chiming a cheerful, mocking note as I stepped into the humid evening air. My skin felt electric, a low-voltage hum vibrating beneath the surface of my scars. I could still see the way the red wine had bled into the cream cashmere of Alina's trousers, a stain that no amount of expensive dry cleaning would ever truly remove. It wasn't just fabric that was ruined. It was the illusion of her untouchable life. I walked 3 blocks to a payphone, an ancient, grimy relic in this digital age, and watched the city lights blur into streaks of neon through the scratched plastic of the booth. I didn't need to make a call. I just needed to stand in the shadows and breathe the air of a free woman who was finally, officially, the predator. While Alina was likely still trembling in that aisle, waiting for a manager to help her navigate the mess she'd made, I had other gears in motion. The first gift was already on its way to the glass and steel monolith Julian called home. It was a penthouse that touched the clouds, built on a foundation of broken promises and forged signatures. I imagined the courier arriving at the front desk, the bored security guard signing for the nondescript manila envelope, and the silent, pressurized ride up the elevator. Julian would be in his study. I knew his habits like I knew the layout of the cell I'd occupied for 3,650 days. He liked the quiet of midnight, the way the city looked like a glowing circuit board beneath him. He would be sitting in that designer armchair, the one made of butter, soft black leather and brushed steel, sipping a scotch that cost more than my monthly restitution payments. The envelope would be sitting on his desk, a small, flat weight against the polished mahogany. I can see him opening it. He uses a silver letter opener, his movements precise and arrogant, the movements of a man who believes he has already won every game worth playing. He expects a contract, a legal threat, perhaps an invitation to a gala he doesn't want to attend. Instead, he slides out a single, glossy photograph. It isn't a high-definition shot. It's grainy, taken from a distance, the colors muted by the harsh, yellow sodium lights of a decade ago. It's the loading dock at Pier 42. The exact spot where the crates were swapped, where the evidence was planted, where I had stood in handcuffs while he whispered in my ear that he'd take care of everything. The air in that $1 million room would turn thin and metallic in an instant. That is the physical sensation of a secret escaping its cage. It tastes like copper on the back of the tongue and feels like a cold blade pressed against the throat. Julian wouldn't scream. He isn't a man who loses control of his voice. He would just go very, very still, his heart rate spiking in a way that would make the expensive watch on his wrist feel tight. He would look at that photograph, searching for a reflection in the dark puddles on the pavement, looking for the ghost of the man he used to be before he traded his soul for a view of the skyline. His first instinct will be cold, calculated action. He will check the security feeds, his fingers flying over the keyboard of his laptop with a frantic rhythm, looking for the face of the messenger. He will find nothing but a hired courier in a helmet. He will call his head of security, a man whose loyalty is bought with a salary that keeps his mouth shut, and he will demand to know how something so personal reached his inner sanctum. But the fear will already be there, coiling in his gut like a cold snake that has been hibernating for 10 years. Then the front door will click open. Elena will come in. She won't be the poised, luminous creature she was this afternoon. She will be a wreck, her hair disheveled, her eyes rimmed with the red of suppressed panic. She'll have changed her clothes, but the scent of that spilled Malbec will still be clinging to her skin, or perhaps it's just the phantom smell of the blood she helped spill. She will see him sitting there, the photograph face down on the desk, and she will see the way his jaw is set like granite. She won't tell him she saw me. Not yet. She's too afraid of what he'll do if he thinks she's the weak link, the crack in the dam. And he won't show her the photo. He doesn't trust her, not really. You can't truly trust someone you've shared a framing with, you only share the burden of the lie. He will look at her, noticing the way her hands shake as she pours herself a drink, and the first seeds of suspicion will take root in the fertile soil of his paranoia. He'll wonder if she's been talking to the wrong people. He'll wonder if she's the reason the past is suddenly knocking on his door at midnight. I want them to eat each other. I want the silence between them to become a living thing, a thick, suffocating fog that fills the penthouse until they can't see their own hands in front of their faces. I want every creak of the floorboards and every flash of a news headline to feel like a personal attack. They spent 10 years forgetting me, scrubbing my name from their history like a persistent stain. I'm going to spend the next 10 days making sure I'm the only thing they can think about when they close their eyes. The police are a blunt instrument, a tool for the final act of a long play. But this is art. This is the slow, methodical disintegration of a fortress. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the distant, glowing windows of their high rise, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the summer air. The nightmare hasn't just started for them. It's become their new reality, and I'm the one holding the pen, writing the ending they never saw coming. I turned my collar up against a sudden breeze, my boots clicking a steady, relentless rhythm on the pavement as I disappeared into the dark. I wasn't just back. I was the storm. The diner is a relic of another era, a place where the air tastes of stale grease and the coffee is strong enough to strip the paint off a radiator. I sit in a corner booth, the vinyl cracked and cold beneath me, my back to the wall. It's 3:00 a.m., the hour when the world is divided into those who are sleeping and those who are hiding. I am neither. I am working. The laptop screen is a harsh blue rectangle in the gloom, illuminating the lines of my face, lines that weren't there 10 years ago, etched by the recycled air of a cell and the slow, grinding weight of injustice. I look at the files one last time. They are beautiful in their complexity, a labyrinth of offshore accounts, shell companies, and signatures that were never meant to see the light of day. I think of Marcus Thorne. He's an investigative journalist with a reputation for being a bloodhound and a penchant for expensive scotch he can't afford. He's currently sitting in a cluttered apartment 3 blocks away, staring at his inbox with the intensity of a man waiting for a miracle. He doesn't know who I am, only that I've given him the first thread of a sweater that, when pulled, will unravel the entire financial district. I hit send. The progress bar crawls across the screen, a tiny digital executioner. When it finishes, I close the lid and take a sip of my coffee. It's bitter, scorching, and exactly what I need to stay sharp. On the wall-mounted television above the counter, a news cycle is looping. It's a financial channel, the kind Julian keeps on in his office at all times to monitor the heartbeat of his ego. The ticker at the bottom is a relentless stream of white text against a black background, but then the color changes. A flash of red, Julian's firm, Sterling and Associates. The headline is vague, unconfirmed reports of massive financial irregularities, but the market is a skittish beast. I watch as the stock price begins its jittery descent. It's not a plunge yet, just a tremor, the sound of the first stone shifting in a massive landslide. I can see Julian in my mind. He isn't in bed, he's in his study, the one with the mahogany shelves and the floor-to-ceiling view of the park. He's staring at his phone, his face pale and sickly in the light of the screen. He'll be calling his lawyers, his PR team, his fixers, the men who move in the shadows to keep his reputation polished. He'll be trying to bridge the gap between the man he pretends to be and the monster he actually is. But the gap is too wide now. The bridge has already been rigged with explosives, and I'm the one with the detonator. Then there's Alina. She'll be in the bedroom, the door locked, clutching a glass of vodka like a rosary. She knows. She's always known that the foundation of their life was a graveyard, built on the bones of my reputation. Every diamond she wears, every gala she attends, is a trophy of the 10 years they stole from me. I can almost hear her breath catching in her throat as she hears Julian shouting into his phone in the other room, his voice cracking with a desperation he hasn't felt in a decade. The silence I left them with earlier has been replaced by the roar of a collapsing empire. I remember the courtroom with a clarity that still makes my blood run cold. I remember the way the light caught the gold of Julian's wedding ring as he testified against me, his voice steady, his eyes full of a manufactured pity that made me want to scream. I remember Alina sitting in the front row, a lace handkerchief pressed to her eyes, playing the role of the grieving friend who couldn't believe my betrayal. They were so convincing. They were the golden couple, the pillars of the community, and I was just the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who got greedy. Now the roles are reversing. The greedy one is the one with the evidence. The golden couple are the ones scrambling in the dirt, trying to find a lie big enough to save them. I watch the news ticker again. The red numbers are growing larger. The descent is accelerating. A house built on sand cannot withstand a storm, and I have spent a decade becoming the hurricane. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that says "Dot," refills my cup. She doesn't look at the screen. She doesn't care about stock prices or offshore accounts. She just sees a middle-aged woman in a dark coat, sitting alone in the middle of the night. "Refill, honey?" she asks, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes. Please, I say. My voice is calm, devoid of the jagged edges it usually carries. It's the voice of someone who has finally found their footing. As she walks away, I feel a strange sense of peace. It isn't the peace of forgiveness, it's the peace of a job well done. The digital fire I started is spreading, consuming the borders of their carefully manicured life. By morning, the name Julian Sterling won't be associated with success. It will be a synonym for scandal. I check my phone. A message from an unknown number, just 3 words. Who is this? I don't reply. I don't need to. Marcus Thorne will find out soon enough, but not from me. He'll find out when he follows the trail of breadcrumbs I've laid out, each one leading closer to the truth of what happened at Pier 42. Each one leading back to the night they ruined my life to save their own. I stand up, leaving a $20 bill on the table. The tip is more than the meal cost, but I'm feeling generous. After all, it's a celebration. I walk out of the diner and into the cool, pre-dawn air. The city is quiet, but I can hear the distant, rhythmic throb of a city waking up. The nightmare is no longer mine. I've handed it back to them, wrapped in a bow of red ticker tape, and I intend to watch every second of the fallout. The walk from the diner to the outskirts of the Heights takes longer than it used to. My joints carry the damp chill of prison winters in a way that sleep can't quite cure. The air is a thin, biting blade against my cheeks as I approach the iron gates of the Sterling estate. I don't go to the front, where the security cameras are perched like predatory birds, waiting for the first sign of a scandal-hungry reporter. Instead, I take the overgrown path through the woods, the one that leads to the service entrance, a heavy wooden door tucked behind a veil of ivy. I still have the key. It's a small, jagged piece of metal I've kept hidden for a decade, a relic of the life they thought they'd erased. It slides into the lock with a groan of neglected iron, and as the door swings open, I'm hit by the scent of lavender and expensive floor wax. It's the smell of a sanctuary built on a foundation of lies. I move through the house like a ghost returning to haunt its own funeral. The kitchen is vast and cold, the marble countertops gleaming under the dim under-cabinet lighting. I hear the muffled sound of a television in the distance. The financial news, no doubt, chanting the liturgy of Julian's downfall. He isn't here. Right now, he's in a glass-walled boardroom downtown, surrounded by men in sharp suits who are currently dissecting his soul to see if there's anything left worth salvaging. I can see him in my mind's eye, sweating through his bespoke shirt, realizing that the board of directors is a pack of wolves that has finally smelled blood. He'll be trying to charm them to lie his way through the discrepancies, but the numbers I leaked don't have a heart to appeal to. I find Alina in the morning room. She's huddled in a wingback chair that costs more than my father earned in a year, her silk robe cinched so tight it looks like she's trying to hold her very skin in place. There's a leather suitcase on the low table in front of her, open and overflowing with stacks of $100 bills. The sight of it makes my stomach turn. It's so predictable, so pedestrian. This is how they solve problems. They throw paper at the holes in their lives and hope the wind doesn't blow. "I knew you'd come," she whispers. Her voice is a fragile, ruined thing. She doesn't look at me. Her eyes are fixed on the money as if it might provide some heat in the freezing reality of her morning. "Take it, Sarah, please. There's nearly $2 million there. It's all the liquid cash we could pull from the safe before the accounts were flagged. Just take it and go. Disappear. Change your name. Start over somewhere where no one knows us." I walk over to the table, the soles of my boots heavy and rhythmic on the hand-woven Persian rug. I reach out and touch one of the stacks. The paper is crisp, the ink smelling of government-sanctioned greed. It's a lot of money. It's a lifetime of security for most people. But I am not most people anymore. I am the woman who spent 3,650 days staring at a cinder block wall because the woman sitting in front of me was too cowardly to tell the truth. You think this is what I want? I ask. My voice is low, steady, devoid of the frantic energy that is currently vibrating off her. I look at her hands. They're shaking so violently she has to tuck them under her armpits to keep them still. She's aged a decade in a single night. The fine lines around her eyes are etched with a terror that no amount of expensive cream can smooth away. It's a fresh start, she pleads, finally lifting her gaze to mine. Her eyes are bloodshot, the whites yellowed by a long, sleepless night and too much cheap vodka. We can make it look like you were never here. We can help you get out of the country. Julian has friends in the Mediterranean. You could have a villa. You could have peace. I lean down, bringing my face close to hers until I can smell the stale alcohol on her breath and the cloying scent of her perfume. Time is the only currency I value, Alina, I say, the words tasting like copper and ash. And you stole 10 years of mine. Do you have 10 years in that suitcase? Can you pull out a single hour of the life I should have had? Can you give me back the moments I missed? My mother's funeral. The way the world changed while I was locked in a box because you and Julian needed a scapegoat. She flinches as if I've struck her, her head snapping back against the upholstery. We had to, she whimpers, the old excuse falling from her lips like a dead leaf. Julian said it was the only way to save the firm. He said you'd be taken care of when you got out. Julian said what he always says, I interrupt, my voice hardening. He said he was more important than the truth, and you believed him because it kept you in silk and diamonds. You traded my life for a bigger house and a better seat at the opera. I stand up straight, looking down at the stacks of bills. Keep your money. You're going to need it for the lawyers. Though from what I hear, Julian's personal assets are being frozen as we speak. This might be the last of the sterling fortune you ever touch. I hope it's enough to buy a good defense because the prosecution is going to be relentless. I turn toward the door, my coat swirling around my ankles. The house feels smaller now, the high ceilings no longer impressive, just hollow. What do you want from us, Sarah? She cries out behind me, her voice cracking into a sob. What will it take to make you stop? I look back at her one last time, silhouetted against the rising sun that's beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. She looks small. Pathetic, a queen whose throne has been revealed to be made of cardboard and spit. I don't want anything from you anymore, I tell her. I just wanted you to know that I was the one who pulled the thread. I wanted you to see the person who dismantled your world. No amount of gold can buy back a soul, Alina. Yours has been gone for a long time. Now, the rest of the world is just catching up to that fact. I leave her there, sitting in the silence of her gilded cage, surrounded by the useless paper she thought could save her. As I walk back through the service entrance and out into the morning, I feel the weight of the past 10 years shifting. It hasn't vanished, but it's no longer mine to carry alone. I've handed the burden back to its rightful owners. The sun is fully up now, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawn. The nightmare is over for me. For the Sterlings, the sun is just beginning to rise on the first day of the rest of their miserable lives. And I have a front row seat to the wreckage. I drove my modest sedan away from the Sterling estate. The engines hum a low, steady purr that felt more honest than anything I'd heard in that house. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was several miles away. And when I finally did, I saw the iron gates shrinking, becoming nothing more than toothpicks against the horizon. The air inside the car still smelled faintly of Alina's expensive, suffocating perfume, a scent of lilies and desperation. I rolled down the window, letting the biting chill of the morning air scrub my lungs clean. I wasn't heading home to the small, sparse apartment that still felt like a transitional cell. I had one last appointment with the ghosts of my past. By the time I reached the downtown district, the city was fully awake, though it was a different kind of energy than the usual morning rush. There was a vibration in the air, a frantic electric pulse that signaled blood in the water. I parked 3 blocks away and walked, my dark wool coat buttoned to the chin, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. I looked like any other office worker, any other passerby. That was my greatest weapon. The invisibility they had forced upon me for a decade was now the cloak that allowed me to watch them burn without being recognized as the match. The park across from the Sterling Global headquarters was already crowded. I found a spot under a skeletal oak tree, its bare branches clawing at the gray, indifferent sky. I blended into a cluster of onlookers, tourists with their phones held high, journalists with their lukewarm coffee cups, and low-level employees who stood in stunned silence, looking as though they'd just been told their lives were forfeit. Across the street, the towering glass monolith that bore the Sterling name looked fragile for the first time. Federal agents in windbreakers with bold yellow lettering moved in and out of the revolving doors like ants swarming a fallen piece of fruit. They were carrying boxes, hundreds of them. Those boxes contained the paper trail I'd painstakingly reconstructed from the shadows, the digital breadcrumbs Julian thought he'd scrubbed from the earth with a single keystroke 10 years ago. Then the doors opened again and the crowd surged forward. The sound of 100 camera shutters firing at once was like the rattle of a distant machine gun. Julian appeared. He wasn't the man I remembered, the man who had stood in the courtroom a decade ago with his chest puffed out, radiating the arrogant certainty of a minor god. Today he looked small. His bespoke suit, which probably cost more than my first car, seemed to hang off his frame, the fabric bunching at his shoulders. His silver hair, usually perfectly coiffed to project an image of stable wisdom, was windswept and messy. He kept his head bowed, chin tucked into his chest as if he could hide from the lenses, but there was no hiding from the truth he'd spent a lifetime burying in shallow graves. As the agents led him toward the waiting black SUV, he stumbled. Just a small trip, a momentary loss of balance on the curb, but it was enough to make the crowd roar with a sudden, predatory hunger. I watched his face as he looked up for a split second, his eyes darting across the crowd. They were hollowed out, 2 dark pits of terror rimmed with the red of a man who hadn't slept in days. He didn't see me. He couldn't see me through the sea of bodies and the glare of the morning sun, but I saw him. I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. The empire was gone. The lies were gone. All that remained was the wreckage of a man who had traded his soul for a seat at the top of a hollow mountain. I felt a strange, cold stillness in my chest. I had expected to feel a rush of heat, a burst of manic joy or a scream of triumph. Instead, it was just the quiet, clinical satisfaction of a ledger finally being balanced. The 3,650 days I'd spent behind bars were a debt that could never truly be repaid in full, but seeing Julian's wrists shackled in steel was the first installment of the interest. The headlines on the digital tickers around the square were already screaming his name, linking him to the fraud, the bribery, and the unexplained disappearance of the evidence that had originally convicted me. The narrative was shifting in real time. The disgraced accountant was becoming the wrongfully accused whistleblower in the eyes of the public. I turned away before they closed the door of the SUV. I didn't need to see him driven away to a holding cell. I knew the layout of those rooms better than he ever would. As I walked back toward my car, I passed a newsstand. Every front page featured Julian's face, captured in the high-definition clarity of his downfall. I caught my own reflection in the glass of a storefront. A woman with hard, steady eyes and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily, but no longer felt the need to grimace. I looked older than I should, the lines around my mouth etched by years of silence, but I looked alive. The nightmare was officially over for me. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, jagged piece of stone I'd carried since the day I walked out of the prison gates, a piece of the wall I'd stared at for a decade. I let it drop into a trash can as I passed. I didn't need the reminder anymore. For the Sterlings, the sun was just beginning to rise on the first day of the rest of their miserable public lives. And for the first time in 10 years, I was looking forward to the evening. I didn't need a key to enter the Sterling estate. In the chaos of the morning's arrests and the subsequent media circus, the heavy iron gates had been left ajar, and the front door's electronic lock had been bypassed by federal technicians who hadn't bothered to reset the code. The house felt like a sinking ship, grand and gilded, yet heavy with the weight of the water rushing into its hull. I walked through the foyer, my boots silent on the marble, passing the portraits of Julian's ancestors, men with high collars and cold eyes who seemed to be looking away in collective shame. I made my way to the back of the house, to the mahogany-paneled sanctuary where Julian had spent decades orchestrating his little wars. The study was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the sour metallic tang of a man who had spent the last several hours in a holding cell, sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I preferred the gloom. I sat in his high-backed leather chair, the one he called his throne, and waited. The leather was cold against my back, a stark contrast to the thin, plastic-covered mattresses I'd grown accustomed to. When the door finally opened, the light from the hallway spilled in, casting a long, trembling shadow across the rug. Julian stumbled in, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He didn't see me at first. He went straight for the decanter on the sideboard, his hands shaking so violently that the crystal clinked against the glass like a frantic heartbeat. He poured a drink, his back to me, his shoulders hunched as if he expected a blow to fall at any moment. "The scotch won't help, Julian," I said softly. He spun around, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. The amber liquid soaked into the Persian rug, a dark stain spreading like a wound. He gasped, a wet, ragged sound that caught in his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, rimmed with the red exhaustion of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. "Clara," he breathed. It wasn't a greeting, it was a prayer or a curse. He didn't try to stand tall. He didn't reach for the phone or demand I leave. Instead, the air seemed to go out of him all at once. He sank to his knees right there amidst the broken glass, his knees hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. He looked small, half the size he had been when he'd stood in that courtroom 10 years ago and watched them lead me away in chains. The bespoke suit that had looked so sharp on the morning news was now wrinkled and stained, hanging off a frame that seemed to have withered in a single afternoon. "It wasn't my idea," he started, his voice a frantic, high-pitched babble. He crawled a few inches forward, his palms pressing into the rug dangerously close to the shards of crystal. "You have to believe me, it was Alina. She was the one who said we needed a fall guy. She said the firm couldn't survive the audit, that someone had to take the hit for the offshore accounts. I wanted to tell them the truth, Clara." I swear, every night I sat in this room and thought about calling the DA, I watched him with the clinical patience of a judge. There was no heat in my chest, no burning desire to scream at him. There was only a profound, freezing clarity. This was the man who had stolen my youth. This was the titan of industry who had traded my life for his reputation. And here he was, reduced to a sniveling heap, blaming his wife for the sins he had signed his name to with a gold-plated pen. She pressured me, he continued, his words tripping over each other. She said if I didn't go along with it, she'd take the kids and leave me with nothing. I was trapped. You know how she is, Clara. She's the one with the ice in her veins. I'm just a man who made a mistake. He looked up at me then, his face wet with tears and sweat, searching my expression for a glimmer of the woman I used to be, the loyal, quiet accountant who had looked at him with something bordering on hero worship. He was looking for mercy, for the soft touch of a subordinate who would tell him everything was going to be all right. I leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking in the absolute silence of the room. The power he had wielded over me for a decade had always been an illusion, a house of cards built on the foundation of my own silence. Now that I had spoken, now that the boxes of evidence were in the hands of people who couldn't be bought, he was nothing. He was a hollow vessel, stripped of the armor of his wealth and his name. "You look pathetic, Julian," I said, my voice steady and low. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He began to babble again, offering me money, offshore accounts, properties in Europe, anything to buy back the soul he'd sold long ago. He didn't understand that he had nothing left to give me. The only thing I wanted from him was the sight of him on his knees, and I already had that. I realized then that my nightmare hadn't ended when I walked out of the prison gates. It ended here, in this darkened room, watching the architect of my misery crumble into the dust of his own making. He wasn't a monster. He was just a small, broken man who had run out of lies. I stood up, the leather of the armchair sighing as I rose, the sound amplified by the hollow silence of the room. Julian reached out, a desperate, clawing motion toward the hem of my coat, his fingers trembling as they brushed the fabric. I didn't flinch. I simply stepped back, letting the shadows of the hallway swallow me. I didn't need to hear his apologies or his frantic bargaining. They were just more debts he could never hope to pay. I walked out of that house without looking back, the heavy weight of the final ledger tucked firmly under my arm. It was a physical thing, bound in worn black leather, the edges frayed from years of being hidden in the damp dark of a floorboard. It felt like a tombstone, the cold, hard record of every life they'd bought and every soul they'd sold, including mine. The night air was crisp, biting at my skin with a cold that felt honest after the suffocating, perfumed warmth of Julian's parlor. I drove straight to the district attorney's office, the city lights blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon against the windshield. There were no sirens, no dramatic chases. Just a quiet, functional building filled with the hum of late-night computers and the medicinal smell of floor wax. I met Assistant DA Miller in a small, windowless room that felt like a confession booth. I placed the ledger on the laminate table between us. The dull thud it made was the loudest sound I'd heard in 10 years. Miller opened it, his eyes scanning the original signatures. Julian's looped, arrogant script and Alina's sharp, clinical hand. I watched his face and saw the exact moment he realized the game was over. There would be no high-priced legal maneuvers this time, no missing evidence, and no witnesses who could be bought or intimidated. The truth was written in their own ink, a permanent stain they couldn't scrub away. The morning of the arraignment arrived with a sky the color of wet slate. I stood on the top step of the courthouse, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my wool coat, watching the circus assemble below. The crowd of reporters was a frantic hive, their cameras flashing like rhythmic pulses of lightning against the gray drizzle. When the transport van pulled up, a heavy hush fell over the pavement, a collective intake of breath from a city that had spent a decade under the thumb of the people now inside that vehicle. They were escorted out together, though they looked worlds apart. Julian appeared haunted, his eyes darting toward the cracks in the pavement, his shoulders slumped as if the very air had become too heavy to support. His expensive suit looked like a costume he'd outgrown. Elena, however, held her chin high, her spine a rigid line of defiance. Her face was a mask of frozen marble, her eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point above the horizon. But as the guards nudged them toward the middle of the stairs, her composure faltered. Her gaze shifted, scanning the crowd with a sudden, sharp hunger until it landed directly on me. For a brief, silent second, our gazes locked. I saw the flash of recognition in her eyes, followed by a raw, jagged realization. She saw that the quiet girl, the loyal accountant who had been a footnote in their grand narrative, was the one who had finally pulled the thread that unraveled their world. I had expected a surge of triumph at that moment, a hot rush of joy that would finally burn away the lingering bitterness of the years I'd spent in a cell. But the heat never came. Instead, I felt only a profound, heavy stillness. The job was finally completed. The ledger was closed, and the balance had been settled. As the guards led them toward the heavy steel doors of the transport van, I watched the silver glint of the handcuffs around their wrists. It was a familiar sight, one I had lived every single day for a decade. They were being taken to the processing center and from there to the state penitentiary. They were going to my old home, to the iron bars and the concrete floors and the endless, ticking seconds of a life stripped of its name. I turned away before the van doors slammed shut, walking down the steps and into the rain, finally a ghost no longer. I breathed in the damp air, and for the first time in 10 years it didn't taste like ash. I walked away from the courthouse without looking back, my boots clicking a steady, solitary rhythm against the slick, oil-stained pavement. The city felt different now, less like a cage and more like a museum of a life I no longer lived. I didn't head toward a waiting car or a rented room. I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and the small, bruised remains of a bank account they hadn't managed to find. I walked until my legs burned, following the invisible pull toward the terminal, toward the iron tracks that promised a clean break from the concrete and the ghosts. The train station was a cavernous ribcage of steel and glass, echoing with the frantic energy of people who still had somewhere to be. I stood at the ticket counter, my voice sounding strange and rusty in my own ears as I asked for a one-way ticket to the northern coast. The agent didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on a screen, his fingers dancing a mindless pattern on the keys. He handed me a slip of paper that felt heavier than it was, a passport to a world where no one knew the woman who had been buried in a cell for 10 years. I found a seat by the window in a nearly empty car. As the train lurched forward, the city skyline began to shrink. Those towering glass monoliths, where Julian had spent his afternoons deciding which lives were worth ruining, and Elena had curated her perfect, frozen existence, turned into a cluster of insignificant, flickering lights. I watched until the last glow of the urban sprawl was swallowed by the encroaching dark of the countryside. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks became a lullaby, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse in time with my own. I looked at my reflection in the darkened. The woman staring back was a stranger, her face etched with lines that hadn't been there when I was the loyal, quiet accountant who believed in the inherent goodness of the people I served. My hair was thinner, my skin paler, and there was a hardness in my jaw that no amount of freedom could soften. But for the first time since I was a young woman with a sharp mind and a naive heart, my name belonged entirely to me. It wasn't a number stamped onto a jumpsuit or a liability tucked away in a corporate file. It was mine, untethered and unspoken, a secret I could finally keep for myself. As the hours bled into one another, the landscape outside changed. The flat plains gave way to rugged hills, and the air that seeped through the window cracks lost the metallic, exhaust-heavy tang of the city. It took on a sharp, briny bite, the smell of cold water and ancient, unyielding stone. The train slowed as it reached the edge of the world, pulling into a small, weathered station that looked as though it were being slowly reclaimed by the salt spray. I stepped off the platform and into the pre-dawn chill. There was no one waiting for me, no house with a hearth, and no fortune tucked away in a hidden account. I had stripped myself of everything to ensure Julian and Alina lost it all, and the emptiness I felt wasn't a void, it was a clean slate. I walked toward the sound of the crashing surf, my feet sinking into the damp, heavy sand. The northern coast was a study in gray and silver. The gulls were already circling, their cries sharp and mocking against the wind. I walked until I reached the water's edge, letting the freezing tide wash over my boots. The sun began to break over the horizon, a jagged line of gold that seemed to cut the world in two. The decade of shadows I had left behind, and the vast, terrifying brightness of what came next. The air here tasted of salt and freedom, untainted by the bitterness of the past. I stood there as the light grew stronger, illuminating the foam that hissed at my feet. I thought of Julian in his cell, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, and Alina, trying to maintain her dignity in a place that stripped everyone of their armor. They were living my old life now, and I was finally living mine. I let the tide pull at me, watching as the retreating waves carried away the dust of the prison and the jagged debris of my revenge. The ledger was closed, the balance was settled, and as the sun finally cleared the water, I turned my back on the ocean and began to walk toward the light.